Good morning, amazing people. Everybody grab a seat or not. We're happy. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Wellman. I work for the Nature Conservancy in Colorado, and I have the wonderful pleasure of working with these colleagues here, and they're going to share perspectives about restoration where there are no beaver. So I'd like to introduce Kimberly Tekavec from Northern Water Conservancy District, Isabel de Silva-Shewell with Rocky Mountain National Park, and Sara Rathburn from Colorado State University. We're all involved with the Kawuneeche Valley Restoration Collaborative. We tend to call it KVRC. And by a show of hands, I'm curious how many people have traveled through the Rocky Mountain National Park's west side in the Kawuneeche Valley at the base of Trail Ridge. Awesome. Oh, lots. Okay. Great. So you might recognize some of these headwater tributaries. Our project sites there on Beaver, Baker, and Onahu Creeks. This watershed once held one of the largest beaver wetland complexes in the whole state of Colorado. And that was, of course, predating European settlement during a time when Ute, Arapaho, Shoshone, Cheyenne, Kiowa, Sioux, and other Native American tribal people resided in and stewarded the region. Today in the valley, the beaver population has drastically diminished, while moose and elk herbivory have disconnected the tall willow stands in the floodplain, and everything has pretty much dried up after 100 years of European-style land uses. And the floodplains and the wetlands are all pretty dry due to hay meadows that are no longer cultivated. Ditches and levees drain the landscape and confine the Colorado River to a single meander, while the prior beaver-ponded wetland complexes disappeared. And then in 2020, the East Troublesome fire was catastrophic and one of Colorado's largest. It impacted homes and forests on the outskirts of the park, and the collaborative evolved as a result of many years of biodiversity crisis and the decline in the wetlands. And so we're all working in response to these cumulative impacts in this watershed. So over the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to tell the story of the work that we're doing to restore wetland resiliency in this beautiful and iconic watershed. This isn't necessarily a project that involves beaver reintroduction, and we want to be really clear about that. The focus is on ecosystem restoration so that the beaver will want to come back. And so I will pass the mic to Kimberly, and she will highlight how we're getting work done on the ground.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Thanks, Jennifer. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Kawuneeche Valley Restoration Collaborative and how we formed and who we are. We formed in early 2020 to assess the conditions in the Kawuneeche Valley and identify potential restoration opportunities and help reverse some of the impacts that Jennifer just described and what Isabel and Sara will talk about in more detail. KVRC members include representatives from Rocky Mountain National Park, the U.S. Forest Service, Grand County, the town of Grand Lake, the Nature Conservancy, Rocky Mountain Conservancy, and Northern Water. In 2020, we began working with a team of researchers from Colorado State University who've been researching this valley for almost 30 years to help us develop a conditions assessment and recommend sites for restoration. So the reasons for doing this work are many, and they are listed on the right of this slide. But really, in summary, KVRC is really working to support restoration of the Kawuneeche Valley to help enhance its ecological, economic, and community well-being. So the remaining presentation will include information about CSU's findings and our approach to restoration, But before I pass it on, I want to highlight really quickly how successful this collaborative has been. We've been busy developing project plans, undergoing environmental compliance work, monitoring baseline conditions, and outreaching to stakeholders and to the general public. This work has been funded by a variety of sources, a lot of which have included contributions from KVRC members, but we've been really successful with grant applications as well. And in total, we've raised over $3 million to date. We've been 100% successful with our grant applications, so we just wanted to say a quick thank you and a quick shout out to the funding agencies listed on this graph. So they include the Colorado Water Conservation Board, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Colorado River District, Grand Foundation's Windy Gap Environmental Fund, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. So we're really happy with the work that we've done so far. So I will pass it on to Isabel, and she's going to discuss the technical findings and conditions.
Thanks, Kimberly. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit, like Kimberly mentioned, about our main findings of our condition assessment of the valley and talk a little bit about our restoration approaches. So first I wanted to paint a picture of what the Kawuneeche Valley used to look like. So on the left-hand side, you can see, as you look down to the valley floor, you can see that the valley was comprised of this really extensive matrix of beaver ponds and tall willows. And today, when you look at the same area, aptly named Beaver Creek, you no longer see this tall willow beaver state. Instead, we have a state that's more what we call an elk moose grassland state. That's a degraded state that we're looking to restore. And one of the main stressors that is key that's caused most of the shifts in this ecosystem have occurred in the last 30 years. And this is due to browsing by both moose and elk on willow. And you might be wondering, what's the connection to beaver? So beavers and willows have a symbiotic relationship in the system where beavers really create suitable hydrology for mesic adapted willows. And then beavers use those willows to build their dams, and they also eat willows. So to give you a sense of quantitatively what this assessment found, when we use aerial imagery across the valley, we found that within Rocky Mountain National Park, we've lost about 98% of our tall willow communities, which is pretty substantial. And you can see what this looks like on the ground here in the mid and background image of these photos. You can see that willows are either being browsed down to the point of mortality or to the point where they're just surviving on a few live shoots. So we're really looking forward to address this degradation. Sort of hand in hand with this loss of tall willows, we've also had about 94% of our beaver ponds dry up and get lost from the system. And this has also coincided with that loss of tall willows in the last 30 years. So this is, again, Beaver Creek that I'm showing you. And here is an example of some of the aerial images we use to quantify this change. And you can see as you go through time, we've nearly lost all of our beaver ponds. So what are we doing to address this degradation? Well, we have a few restoration approaches, the first of which is ungulate exclosure fencing. So these fences are tall fences that exclude elk and moose from browsing the willows. In this example image, I'm showing you what it looks like when you fence willows off and allow them to grow just for 7 years in the Kawuneeche Valley. So this is an example of sort of the state that we're trying to push the system towards. Some of the most common questions I get about the fence are, can other wildlife and humans access this fence and this habitat? And the answer is yes. There's a gap at the bottom of the fence that allows small wildlife to still utilize this wetland. And we also encourage people to utilize the gates so they can enter into these wetlands. Another thing that we're doing is I want to take a step back. One other thing that we want to achieve with allowing these willows to regrow, obviously we want them to regrow to their former stature so they can better resist elk and moose browsing when that happens. But tall willows can also produce seed for the next generation of willows. They're also really critical habitat for a lot of native species, a lot of migratory songbirds, etc. So these are really key species that we're looking to restore. Another thing that we're doing to sort of address the invasion of non-native species that we've had due to homesteading and disturbance, we're doing a manual and herbicide treatment of non-native species, some of which include Canada thistle, reed canary grass, and orange hawkweed, so that we can better allow not only willows but other native wetland vegetation to grow back in these systems. And lastly, what I'll talk a little bit about later in more detail is we're doing beaver mimicry efforts where we're looking to install beaver dam analogs, post-assisted log structures, and in some instances, simulated beaver structures to really kickstart the hydrological restoration and reconnect the channel and floodplain. And Sara will talk a little bit more about monitoring, and I just wanted to provide a picture of a progress shot of a BDA being built. And the last thing I'll note, this is a really exciting photo time series from a month ago and about 2 weeks ago, pre and post installation of our in-stream structures. And you can see there's already a lot of substantial increases in stage height, even in base flow conditions. So we're really excited to show some of these restoration successes. And Sara will now talk a little bit more about the conceptual framing and approach to this. So.
Thanks, Isabel. So we have focused on understanding the processes that have been operating in the past and those operating currently. So this way we can integrate a process-based approach fundamentally into the restoration design and the monitoring plan. So a good way to understand processes is to develop a conceptual model, or have one of your graduate students develop a conceptual model for you, as in my case. Connor Mertz, my master's student, is working in the Kawuneeche Valley, and he developed this model inspired by some of Ellen Wool's work. So what you can see is some of the system change that you've heard about from the other speakers. That then altered the ecosystem by the loss of beaver. So crossing this threshold that is illustrated by this dash line on the center of the slide. The loss of beaver dams that pond water, extensive wetlands, and then multi-thread channels drove some of the process changes that are indicated in this feedback cycle down below. So first of all, the base level dropped as indicated by the red down arrow that then disconnected the channel and the floodplain, increased flow velocity, which increased then the sediment transport and caused channel incision and simplification and channelization, which we've heard about previously. Interestingly, though, there are some persistent and legacy features that can actually benefit restoration. And those include the relic dams that create this hydraulic roughness or floodplain roughness, can pond water, okay, attenuate flow, and actually spread it out on the floodplain, as well as the relict fine-grained sediments that have been collecting in beaver ponds over time. So understanding how to use these relic features in restoration can be really helpful. So you saw some of the historical data that were used, some of the imagery. The current data was collected over 2 summers. Connor did a lot of field work in many of these areas, as well as some ongoing remote sensing and some hydraulic modeling. But we were focused on quantifying the hydrology, so measuring the flow, gauging the flow, and measuring sediment transport, surveying the channel bathymetry to understand incision, as well as to link the topography to a pre-existing LIDAR data set, so we had really good high-resolution DEMs. Understanding the grain size changes and the spatial distribution of some of these relic beaver pond sediments, so probing the floodplain, describing bank stratigraphy, as well as evaluating bank erosion. So those data have been really fundamental in being incorporated into the restoration designs, okay, which you'll hear more about again from Isabel, but also serving as pre-restoration baseline conditions to then be developed into our monitoring plan. So the monitoring plan is sort of nicely illustrated by this Ben Goldfarb illustration, where we've developed hydrologic, geomorphologic, and ecologic indicators that would hopefully follow a trajectory of an incised channel that's disconnected with increased ponding due to beaver mimicry structures in our case, to overbank flooding and changes in the water level, multi-thread channel, and increases in riparian vegetation. So we're committed to 5 years of collecting post-construction data for monitoring, as well as maintaining these structures, because we don't quite yet have the ecosystem engineers yet, but we're hoping that we will enhance the conditions and they will come. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about our beaver mimicry structures. So at our first pilot site, Beaver Creek, we're employing 3 different kinds of structures. The first of which is the most classic that you're probably most familiar with, beaver dam analogs. These are comprised of interwoven woody material, packed sediment, and clods of vegetation, and are driven with untreated posts to secure them in place. We also have post-assisted log structures, which are more of our speed bump-like structures that are comprised of untreated posts and interwoven woody material that help us slow the water down and trap some sediment. And I should step back and say that all of these structures are designed in order to connect the channel and floodplain again, to raise groundwater table, to accumulate sediment and degrade the channel. And the last structure type, so I introduced the first 2 process-based restoration structures. We also have a structure called what we call simulated beaver structures. And these are more static structures that are really helping us address this really severe channel incision at Beaver Creek. And these structures are comprised of dimensional untreated lumber, cedar, and these are keyed into the banks. They're about 5 feet tall and are just below bankful elevation, and they really help us get that lift quickly initially at the start of restoration. So across Beaver Creek, I'm showing you a map here of all of our structures, and you can see that the takeaways that PALs and BDAs are pretty widely distributed across our site, and we've strategically put 3 simulated beaver structures in place. And these simulated beaver structures are co-located with really old, large beaver pond margins, so we're really harnessing the carved topography that beavers left us. And on the right-hand side, you could see some of our modeling that we've done to predict flow and inundation outputs from these structures. We've strategically not labeled the depth of inundation just to provide a word of caution against trusting models too much. But basically, you can see that we're expecting to get a lot of infilling of former beaver ponds with this design. And anecdotally, I'll just say that we're only 3 weeks away from installing these structures, and there's beaver ponds 500 feet to the south of the channel that are already filling up previously, which only happened with snowmelt. So we're really excited to see such instantaneous effects, and have to more religiously wear our muck boots across this wetland. And that, I'll pass it over to Jennifer to wrap us up.
We only have a few seconds. Lovely slide. I do want to say that there are a few beaver that have returned to this area, fortunately, in the last couple years. So we're starting to see some ponding and areas outside of Beaver Creek, and hopefully the beaver will migrate and move in and help that landscape persevere and transform the land. And we are learning a lot in this process. And sorry we don't have a baby beaver photo. We tried. But please visit the website, kvcollab.org. A little odd, but helpful, hopefully, in characterizing more of this project. And come visit. We do a lot of great tours in the summer, and amazing, and we do have, a lot of information with us. So if you're interested, please visit us after the talk, and we have some frequently asked questions and little handouts. All right. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, it's great to see a full room. I am really pleased to see some lovely photos on these slides. Oh, it's so fun to watch all of your work. And now I'm going to be introducing Catherine Leininger, taking the stage now. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm a assistant professor in the Department of Geography here at CU. And today I want to talk to you about a research project that my former master's student Huck Reese and I completed a couple years ago that relates to sedimentation and carbon accretion or carbon accrual in that sediment in beaver ponds and their implications, potential implications of our data for restoration. So you've heard this before. It's nice to have some of these sort of bigger intro talks before this talk. But Beaver promotes sedimentation and carbon storage in river corridors or channels, floodplains, and the hyporheic zone. And they promote lateral connectivity, so channel to floodplain connectivity, and have the potential to, say, reconnect incised streams or degraded streams to their floodplains. But this figure from Pollock et al. Demonstrates that sort of progression, but that progression and this reconnection really requires sedimentation. It requires sediment storage. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And also, beaver ponds and the sediment within those ponds tend to store a high amount of carbon, either in particulate organic matter or carbon that's stuck to clays and silts within those ponds. And they also, beaver ponds also tend to attenuate sediment fluxes after disturbance, for example, fire. And here's a figure from a recent paper from Sara Rathburn's work that discusses that. But as we know, beaver populations were massively reduced. After European arrival, their current numbers are very low compared to where they were previously. And this indicates that we really do need more data to estimate current storage of sediment in beaver ponds and carbon associated with that sediment. And we also need data in order to be able to potentially predict what might change on the landscape if beaver were allowed to repopulate or were reintroduced on the landscape. Another aspect of this that is interesting is that there is increased interest in carbon storage in river corridors. So here we have a figure of a river corridor with few human alterations, showing carbon stored in sediment or soil, standing vegetation or above ground biomass, and downed wood. And down at the bottom are some examples of how we have significantly altered river corridors, including removed beaver, that have likely reduced that carbon storage on the landscape. So carbon storage is a potential benefit of restoration approaches. And there's been a lot of interest, I think, in this, also in the idea of carbon credits for riparian restoration, so funding restoration through the selling of carbon credits. But this means that we really need to better understand carbon dynamics in rivers and the effect of beaver on carbon, for example. And so, this interest has significant implications for beaver and beaver mimicry in stream restoration. So, previous studies have indicated that beaver ponds store sediment. We actually have relatively limited data on sedimentation rates. So how fast do ponds accumulate sediment and the associated carbon? We also have still relatively limited data across two different timescales, so short-term sedimentation rates, but we have some data on long-term sort of Holocene, thousands of years, how do beaver grade sediment within a valley bottom. But I would also say we lack data on ponds that tend to be more persistent or sort of repopulated by beaver on the landscape. So we don't understand sort of the decadal timescale, which may be particularly important for management decisions if we're thinking about ways to store sediment and carbon on the landscape. So here are a couple of figures from some papers that relate sediment volumes or sedimentation rates, aggradation rates of sediment versus pond age. And you can see that there's limited data with more persistent ponds or ponds that are abandoned then repopulated, for example. So the questions that we wanted to ask is what is the rate of sedimentation and sediment-associated carbon accretion in beaver ponds, trying to extend the time scale of our understanding. So thinking about all different kinds of ponds and how of various ages. And also, can we estimate, using field data, field-derived data, can we estimate how long it would take to reconnect incised channels to their floodplains through beaver-related sedimentation? Okay. And so we conducted this work at a couple of sites in a critical zone network that we're a part of on two streams, Trout Creek shown on the top there and Coal Creek in the middle. And we have multiple reaches within each of these streams. And here I'm highlighting sort of a classification of what those reaches look like geomorphically. So on Trout Creek, most of Trout Creek and most of the ponds on Trout Creek are incised. And so we have this terrace and an eroding bank and an incised kind of entrenched stream channel on Trout Creek. On Coal Creek, we have more, most of the beaver ponds that we assessed were either located in beaver meadows, which was referred to before, but sort of a multi-thread, well-connected valley bottom with lots of ponds, or they were also located on ponds off-channel. And this becomes important later on when we start thinking about sedimentation rates. So I just want to draw a contrast between incised streams, but also reaches and incised reaches, and lower energy environments such as beaver meadows or off-channel ponds. Okay. So we measured sediment depths in 45 ponds. This is a lot of work that Huck and others and myself contributed to. We collected sediment to determine carbon content, so the percent of carbon by mass in that sediment grain size, and we also estimated a carbon stock, so a mass of carbon stored on the landscape. Here's a picture of Huck coring a particular sticky pond in Coal Creek. And then we also looked at the aerial photo record to assess pond age, and this is how we're getting at our sedimentation rates. So how old is the pond, how much sediment is stored, what's the rate of aggradation in that pond. We also used a method of dating called short-lived radionuclides and radiocarbon dating, and what these methods do is leverage the timescale of radioactive decay of different isotopes to help us understand sedimentation rates and the age of sediment in ponds. So what did we find? We found, I'm just going to give you a couple highlights from the project. Here we have a plot of sedimentation rate on the y-axis and pond age on the x-axis on Coal Creek and Trout Creek. And we found that the integrated sedimentation rates, and I'm calling them integrated because we're not able to understand sort of the full history of the sediment in that pond. There might be scour and fill, but we're measuring a sediment depth and we're assigning an age to it and getting one sort of integrated rate. But we find that it decreases dramatically with pond age. And this is likely due to ponds filling to capacity and maybe being abandoned by beaver over time. There might be a signature of sort of repeat scouring and filling in these data too of the sediment behind beaver ponds or behind beaver dams. But I do want to point out that the data set that we have has extended the time scale of our data sets that we currently understand for beaver ponds and sedimentation rates. Okay. So we can, these are linear scale data. We can plot this on a log scale, and we can create statistical relationships where we relate sedimentation rate on the y-axis to pond age, and this provides a way to sort of estimate and predict sedimentation rate with pond age if we're thinking about trying to estimate sedimentation and sediment storage across the landscape. Our median sedimentation rate is about 6 centimeters per year, okay, across these data. And we also use these short-lived radionuclides, this dating method that uses radioactive decay. And a couple of things I want to point out here. We have depth on the y-axis, and the top row is one sediment core of an older pond that we cored, and then the bottom row is another one. And these are both on Trout Creek in those incised reaches, okay? Those kind of entrenched reaches. And we also found a couple of pieces of organic matter that we used radiocarbon dating to date. And here what we see, sort of big take home, is if we look at an age plot over here, we see that the top 10 to 20 centimeters of sediment in both of these ponds is really young. It's about 1 to 3 years old, okay? And then that sort of young sediment is sitting on top of older sediment, which we know through our radiocarbon dates here at different depths. And so what we interpret this as is evidence of scour and fill. So that pond that we cored stored sediment, but that has been sort of episodically removed and then stored again, and removed and stored. And I think an interesting thing here is that these fallout radionuclides and radiocarbon dating can help us understand the retention timescale and also the fate of particular packets of sediment over time in beaver ponds. And this says sour and fill, but I mean scour and fill. So we found that there's the episodic scour and fill dynamics from these dating methods that we employed really helps explain the rapid reduction of this integrated sedimentation rate over time. And so there's a pretty steep decline in sedimentation rates as ponds get older because it's sort of keeping the signature of removal and deposition. So, these cores are on Trout Creek. I do want to draw a little bit of a distinction, and I think this is important from a management context, that there seems to be differences in sedimentation dynamics or sedimentation characteristics depending on the geomorphic context. So in Coal Creek, which the ponds were in beaver meadows or off-channel ponds, we found more evidence of continuous sedimentation. So here on the top left is sediment depth versus pond age. The older ponds got, the deeper the sediment got. And we see a less steep decline in sedimentation rates with pond age here, which indicates that there's more continuous sedimentation processes. So this speaks to the importance of, if a management goal is to store sediment on the landscape, is to reduce incision on a landscape, that it's important to think about low energy environments to promote continuous sediment deposition. So this could be things like trying to reduce incision initially to create lower energy environments. It speaks to the importance of avulsion processes, or the ability of the river channel to create a side channel and shift its location to create, so beaver may be able to create off-channel ponds that then store sediment and carbon. And the idea that in order to reduce incision, you have to store sediment, and incised streams, it takes a while to aggrade those incised streams, has been around in the literature, but I think the unique part of our research project is that we've begun to quantify these rates and to better understand how all the factors work together to, say, for example, predict different timescales of reducing incision. And to that effect, we have this sort of big field data set, right, where we looked at sedimentation rates versus pond age. And so what we could then do is Huck employed a Monte Carlo simulation, a sort of statistical method where we have distributions of our data, and we can sample from those distributions 100,000 times and try to estimate how long it would take to reconnect an incised channel with sedimentation due to beaver activity. And this figure on the top sort of demonstrates what this approach does. If we take one of our reaches that's highly incised and we use our field data, we use the aerial photo data that can tell us, okay, how long are these ponds inundated versus not inundated? Can we move to this morphology, which is sort of a well-connected channel floodplain environment, maybe wetter, for example, stores more carbon, stores more sediment. How long would that take with the field data and our relationships between sedimentation rate and pond age? And we found that it can take quite a long time. So this is a frequency distribution, a histogram of out of all of these simulations, how much time would it take to fill in a channel? And the median of that is 96 years, and the range is quite large, right? So this is just an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about incised channels and trying to understand how beaver recolonization or beaver mimicry structures would potentially result in aggradation. So we also estimated carbon accretion rates or carbon accrual, sequestration on the landscape in sediment. And we had a wide range of those because we had a wide range of sedimentation rates. But these rates are higher than many rates published within floodplain environments. So, ponds do have the potential to store quite a bit of carbon pretty quickly. But I think it's important to note that constraining fluxes or inputs and outputs of carbon is really important for understanding how, say, restoration might change carbon storage on the landscape. And this sediment signature, this sediment stock of carbon, might take quite a while to accrue, and that sort of timescale needs to be accounted for. I recently worked with a human geographer who works on markets for ecosystem services, Rebecca Lave, to think about river restoration in the context of carbon markets. And this figure comes from a recent commentary piece that we did, where, if we think about restoration, we can shift baseline carbon storage conditions by creating wetter environments with finer sediment storage and wood storage and storage and standing biomass. But if the community is interested in selling carbon credits to fund river restoration, we really need to have a better understanding of how all of these inputs and outputs of carbon at a river reach scale come together to assess, result in a change in storage. And so I think that's a really important piece to point out. So just to summarize, we found different relationships between sedimentation rates and pond age, depending on geomorphic context, so in size streams versus sort of lower energy reaches. We found evidence of scour and fill dynamics in these incised streams, trying to sort of understand and date individual sediment packets with radionuclides. We found relatively long time periods for reconnecting incised channels to floodplains using a large field-based data set. And there's a high potential for carbon accretion or carbon storage within ponds. And field data can really help us understand and predict timescales of beaver modifications for restoration goals and what might need to happen in a river reach to sort of get things going, right? What would need to happen in order to actually retain sediment and aggrade channels? And speaking of prediction, I just want to end by talking about an ongoing project led by Joel Schultes at CU Boulder and CMU, where we're working with a master's student to incorporate beaver dams in numerical modeling approaches and trying to assess and predict watershed scale sediment storage, say, for example, upstream of a reservoir that has sedimentation problems. This is the Paonia Reservoir shown here. And so we're working on these questions, but in addition to extending timescales of understanding, we also want to extend across spatial scales. So think about watersheds, for example. So with that, I just want to thank our collaborators and funding for the project that I talked to you today. And if there's time, I'm not sure if there is, but I'm happy to take questions. Thanks. Yeah, there's 2 minutes. So yeah, maybe one question. None of the study sites were in recent wildfire scars. So yeah, and I think it would, one of Sara Rathburn's former master's students has a fire-specific sedimentation study that I noted, done et al. So yeah, that might be interesting to you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the question was, how do I account for compaction of sediment in the ponds? And yeah, that's a great question. That might also be part of this sort of lower sedimentation rate over pond age. And that's why we wanted to go after this radionuclide dating to try to understand more about the fate of individual sediment packets. And yeah, I think that when we estimated mass, we tried to account for, we sampled and accounted for differences in bulk density to some extent. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that more. So is it time to change, or is there one more question? Okay, in the back, thanks. What's the main challenge of sampling in the field? I'm looking at my graduate student, Huck. I think that, there's a lot of spatial variability within a pond and sediment depths. So beaver, as we all know, are active managers of their landscape, and they move stuff around, and they, push sediment. And so I think, just ensuring that the measurements that we take accurately represent spatial variability means that we have to take some time and think about how we sample, and getting stuck is a potential. It has happened. Do field work with other people. Thank you.
Thank you so much.